I'm a firm believer that at all stages of this continuum, practically all stages of this continuum, you can completely reverse any illness.
Hello and welcome to Health and Humanity, a health podcast show centered around living healthier lifestyles and improving our human connection and relationships. I have with me today Dr. Sina McCullough. Dr. Sina McCullough is the author of Beyond Labels and Hands Off My Food. She holds a PhD in nutritional science and a BS in neurobiology, physiology, and behavior, both from the University of California at Davis. She was the director of R&D for a supplement company and taught biochemistry and bioenergetics at UC Davis. Despite her knowledge, she developed an autoimmune disease, which prompted her to launch an investigation into our food supply. What she learned saved her life. She reversed the disease without the use of medication. Now Dr. McCullough is dedicated to helping others avoid the health challenges she has faced. She offers consulting, online programs, and free educational content on her website, handsoffmyfood.com. Dr. Sina, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I'm super excited to talk about your new book, Beyond Labels. It's been out for about a little over a month now?
Almost a month.
Awesome. That's great. Good for you. And I understand that the co-author is a farmer by the name of Joel Salatin. I want to give you a quick minute here to tell me a little bit more about Joel. But before you do so, I thought it was so neat that you paired up with Joel Salatin. He is somebody I've known about for a little over 5 years now. I first came across Joel through a guy by the name of Ty Lopez. He's a pretty well-known entrepreneur, influencer, investor. He's got a really big social media presence. He does all kinds of online education, and he actually has called Joel Salatin a mentor of his throughout most of his adult life. Has worked with Joel on his farm in his younger days. So Ty Lopez, somebody I follow, has talked about Joel Salatin for a very long time, and then I came across your book and saw that you co-wrote it with Joel Salatin, so I thought that was really neat how everything kind of came full circle there. So why don't you tell our audience here a little bit more about how you came about working with Joel and some of the work that he does on his farm and working with him for the book.
Sure, I'd love to. So the book, Beyond Labels, came about because after I wrote my first book, Hands Off My Food, I went on a speaking tour, and all these people showed up that were sick. Like either they were sick or somebody in their family was sick, and they thought that it was probably related to the food supply. So they came and heard my lectures, and the question I got over and over afterwards is, okay, I'm convinced there is something wrong with the food.
Yep. What
do I do about it? Like, how do I actually help myself? How do I heal myself? How do I heal my child or my husband? And what was interesting to me was it wasn't just people who were at the beginning of their healing journey. Like, it wasn't just people, as Joel and I described, that were like the gas food junkies, right? Getting a lot of their food from the gas stations.
Yeah.
It was also people who were already eating organic, that were following healing protocols, and they weren't getting resolutions to their health ailments. So they all had tried different things. They were all at different points in their healing journey, and they were stuck and very frustrated. And as you're probably well aware, they couldn't find answers in the conventional Western medicine system. So they just didn't know who to turn to. So after this happened over and over again, at the end of the talk circuit, I said, well, okay, what can I do about this? How can I be part of the solution to help them? Because I know how it feels to be alone and to know there's something wrong, to not have people believe you, and to really just need someone to guide you, just that one step to get you in the right direction. So I decided to create this book, Beyond Labels, and it's designed with a continuum in mind. So, so basically the continuum goes from, on one end, you have people who are sick and, tired, fatigued, not taking responsibility, not trusting the food supply. And on the other side of the continuum is health, happiness, and freedom, trust, personal responsibility. And the whole book is designed around this continuum so that you choose your own adventure. It's not one of these diet books where it's like you have to read 150 pages of all the things that are wrong with the food and with your pantry, and everything's toxic, throw all your food out, and then 150 pages into it, we give you a cookie cutter diet to follow. It's not like that. It is a choose your own adventure. Yeah. So you identify where you are currently at on this continuum. And there's a series of simple tips. We call them practical bites. And there's 72 of them in the book. And they're designed to move you all the way from starting at the gas station all the way to developing your own homestead. So it is this wide continuum, and it's based on our principles of, health, freedom, personal responsibility, and trust. Yep. And the beauty of it is you not only get to pick where you start, identify where you start, you get to pick your end goal. And we walk you through that in the beginning, how to pick it. Basically, we set you up for success. Yeah. How to pick your goal, how to choose the positive affirmations to get you there, how to visualize it. So it's really unlike any other book in that we chose consciously to not instill fear in people. I think fear is used a lot, especially in the food industry, to get you motivated to do something. And Joel and I both agree that fear is not the right motivator, that love is actually the right motivator. Yeah. So one of the biggest compliments that we have received from this book is that it's so non-judgmental, that we truly meet you where you are, we don't judge you for it, and we just try to encourage you to get to the next tip at your own pace, a pace you can sustain. So that the idea was there, but I knew that if I was going to really put forth a book that was going to help people the most, that I had limitations. Even though I have a doctoral degree in nutrition, and as you mentioned, I was able to reverse a chronic disease and help others do that, I still only know part of the food story, right? I'm a consumer. Yep. And I knew I needed to pair with a food producer, one that I shared the same principles with, one that I respected, one that I knew I could learn from, and one that I thought would be a good role model for how our food should be produced. Yeah. And so, of course, that is Joel Salatin. Sure. So I had it in mind. So I went. We actually did not know each other very well at all. I met him once at a meeting, and that was it. We said hi, and then what happened was we were both asked to be the keynote speakers for a fundraising event. And I spoke first, and I was completely nervous because Joel Salatin was in the audience in the front row, and he was going to speak second. And after I talked, I sat down right next to him, and I just put my head down. I thought I just blew it, right? And he looked at me, and he said, "You just thoroughly impressed me." Wow. I'm like, really? And I'm like, oh my goodness, because I feel like, a kid on the first day of school. I'm so nervous. Yeah. And his wife was there, and she just laughed at me, and she said, "Are you kidding me? His pen ran out of ink because he was taking so many notes." So that's cool. I just looked at him and I said, "Hey, do you want to write a book together?" And he goes, "Sure."
No way.
Yeah. And
he's right on the spot.
Just right on the spot. Something came over me. I say the spirit came over me and just asked him, "Do you want to write a book together?" He said, "Sure." And he goes, "Well, what's the book about?" I said, "I don't really know. I have a general idea based on feedback I've gotten, from people. But I said, I think if we stick with our principles, stay true to ourselves, and honor what these people want, I said, then God will fill in the rest." And he said, cool. He goes, "I'm in."
I love it. I love that. What was the topic of that talk that you gave? What was like some of the main things that you covered?
So my talk was 5 minutes to health, happiness, and freedom.
Okay.
So what I was trying to do was meet the consumers. You know, my audience, my subscribers are very different than, in general, than Joel's subscribers. So mine are the consumers who are sick or a family member is sick, and they want quick solutions.
Okay.
So what I did was I crafted this entire talk where I would tell you a problem with the food supply, and then I would tell you a solution that would take you 5 minutes or less to implement.
Wow.
And that actually is how, that was the book, the birth of the book.
Yeah.
That talk was actually the genesis of the book.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I didn't know how it would go over, right? Because most people in the audience were farmers. But I took a chance. And Joel hates labels. So here I am up there talking about food labels and look for this label. And he's like, we want you to get out of the grocery store. You have to meet them where they are. Like they're at labels. We're in the grocery store. And so it was a really interesting dynamic that we created between our two ideologies and how we meshed them together. I mean, in fact, to our knowledge, this is the first time in history that a farmer and a doctor have teamed up to not only reveal what's really happening in the food supply, but then to provide easy solutions that are practical and affordable.
That's super neat.
Yeah.
What, with Joel Salatin, what, in terms of his ideology, what drew you to him in terms of like how he farms? And I know he's an organic farmer and definitely thinks outside of the box compared to your traditional farming. What was it for you that kind of drew you to him with his ideology when it comes to farming?
Yeah, so there's so many things. I'll start with his farming ideology, and then if you allow me to indulge, go into his personal ideology.
Yeah, please do.
So I was drawn to Joel by the way that he farms, because he farms regeneratively. So it is beyond organic. And it's the way that we have developed right now that is most closely aligned with nature. So his farming to me is in harmony with nature as close as you can actually get. Wow. And that manifests in the quality of the food. So one thing that I learned on my healing journey is that the source of food, of your food, is so critically important. So for instance, if I was going to try to eat meat from the grocery store, even organic meat from the grocery store, and this is when I was at my rock bottom, when I was really sick, my body rejected that meat. Like I was not able to digest it, which was a big problem for me because I had to take all grains and beans and legumes out of my diet. So there was a point where I was severely protein deficient. And I was undergoing muscle wasting like a cancer patient would experience. So like I lost 15 pounds in 1 month, even though I was almost constantly eating. Well, because I was so protein malnourished, we were at the point where we knew I wasn't going to make it if we didn't do something drastic to change it.
Wow.
And we tried all different kinds of meats from the grocery store. You know, nothing worked. So then I found Joel because my husband remembered reading about him in Omnivore's Dilemma.
Okay.
He was like, I think that farm's in Virginia. It's like Poly something. So he looked it up and he found it online. He went to the farm and he filled up the cooler with all different kinds of meats, brought it home. I pressure cooked it. Lo and behold, I was able to eat the food. So I was like, there's really something here. You know, like the fact that I can't eat organic in a grocery store, but I can eat his food. Like, why is it that different? Right. You know? And it really...
Sorry, if I can just cut you off there quickly. For those that are listening, it's Polyface Farms, correct? Is the name of Joel's farm?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Sorry.
Polyface Farm. So that really cued me into switching from conventional to organic is a fantastic step in your journey. It really does reduce a large toxic burden on your body. But in my experience, what I was witnessing firsthand was that there was something even better, something even more healing beyond organic. And I didn't quite know what it was at the time.
Yeah.
So what we did was we toured the farm. We went on his lunatic tour, lunatic tour. I think this was lunatic farmer tour.
Nice. I like it.
Yeah, and it was just fantastic, and it was very eye-opening to see how different it is from like industrial farming. Because even what I've learned so many things from him in writing this book. One thing that was shocking to me that organic can also be factory farmed. So most of the chickens in the grocery store that are labeled organic, they weren't in cages, but they were still in a factory in an enclosed housing.
Yep.
And so close together, like like half a sheet of paper is what they get. And free range doesn't mean they're out there frolicking around in the grass.
Right.
It means they can extend their appendix, like their appendage, right? I mean, that's crazy. So it may sound like, oh, well, what kind of implications are there for my health because a chicken is raised in this confined house? But it's actually very damaging to your health because I'm sure probably most of your listeners and viewers have heard of leaky gut.
Yep.
Right? In humans, that we develop leaky gut for a multitude of different triggers, including chemicals in the food supply. And that leak can lead to systemic inflammation that leads to chronic disease or inflammatory diseases as well. Yeah. So we're seeing the same thing happening in these organically raised chickens that are in these confined houses. Because if you can imagine, it's dry in there and they scratch and like fecal particles, for instance, get aerosolized and they're breathing this in, like they're breathing in the ammonia, going through their nasal passages and, and it's going down into their gastrointestinal tract. And in essence, they develop leaky gut. And so they're developing these inflammatory diseases just like we are. And it's not just the meat chickens, it's the ones that lay the eggs too. We now know that when you have a breach in their gut, there's different pathogens and such that can actually travel down into the egg. So organic, and I don't want to discourage people from going from conventional to organic because like I said, it is an improvement. Sure. Technically, it's supposed to mean that now there's no GMOs, that it's most of the pesticides and herbicides are not used. Most of the antibiotics are not used. In terms of produce, it means there's no sewage sludge that's used, which we now know the sewage sludge can contain high levels of heavy metals. Wow. So clearly it is a step up in decreasing your toxic burden. But what I'm saying is I learned from Joel that there's something even more healing beyond the organic label. So that really drew me to him because I felt it firsthand, right? And I started learning more about his practices, and I just thought everybody should be eating this kind of food, right? And so I wanted to help get that message out. But also, I knew that Joel was a good fit for me because principally we're so aligned. Like we both don't like labels. Yep. Right? We don't like boxing ourselves in, which is another facet of how we created the title Beyond Labels. Yeah. It's not just addressing food labels in the grocery store. It's actually addressing all the labels that we allow ourselves to adopt from society, right? Whether that be from the time that you're a child and they're telling you that you're not good at art, or, oh, you're the athletic one. Oh, no, you're the smart one. And we adopt more and more labels as we continue through our lives, Republican, Democrat, like they're everywhere. And Joel and I are both firm believers that these labels are limiting and that in many ways, because they limit your belief system, they can keep you sick or they can also make you sick. Yep. It can prevent you from achieving optimal health and wellness. So we give many examples throughout the book because part of our goal is to help you to release yourself from these labels and hence the principle of freedom, right? There's a whole nother level of freedom that people don't tend to talk about. So I'll give you an example. In the book, we don't actually prescribe any one diet. Like I said, we want to help you to find your optimal diet for yourself. Yep. And we do that by trying to help you tap into your own body's intuition. So we believe that in the quest for health and wellness, a lot of us tend to follow different dietary protocols like keto or paleo or Whole30. And we're not attacking those diets. There's a time and place for those. What we're saying is, I mean, I used AIP diet to try to reverse my condition. So there is a therapeutic time and place for them. What we're saying is, let's move beyond those, right? Let's help somebody move beyond it so they can create their own individualized diet based on their body's needs, because your needs change. Even throughout the day, your needs change. And if you're following somewhat a man-made dietary protocol, you're conforming, right? You're promoting conformity instead of expressing your individuality. So we want to help. So we want to help people to basically communicate with their bodies so they can identify who they really are, and they can express that even through their food choices throughout the day.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm really happy you brought that up with the different diets that we have, whether it's paleo, vegan, keto. I mean, there's so many. Like, it just goes on and on and on. And I've talked about this quite a bit in recent podcast episodes of mine. That each one of those diets, they try to market it as like they are the only diet for everybody, when it's just the complete opposite. Like you said, everybody has different needs, and those needs can change and will change throughout our life. So it really makes no sense for every single person to be having one specific diet for their whole life. So I'm happy you guys are talking about that.
That's exactly right. You know, I told one of my friends, because she's like, what do you eat? You know, that's the main thing. Most people contact me and they're like, just tell me what to eat. And I'm like, you know, I wish it was that easy, because I totally understand where you're at. You know, like I was there too. I'm like, just tell me the answer so I can get better, you know? But the answer really lies within yourself. And, you know, and it is that connecting to yourself. So for instance, if you were to come stay with me for a week and we ate together every meal, for the first 3 days, you would probably label me as a vegan, right? Somebody who's a vegan, who eats a lot of good quality fats. You know, I tend to eat a high fat diet. And then maybe the 4th day, you know, I'm going to add in some polyface meat to my meal. And then you might look at it and be like, oh, wait a minute, maybe she's paleo, right? Label me as paleo. But so it changes, it fluctuates. And now that I'm pregnant, now my body wants meat with every meal. And it's happy like that. So if I was just stuck in the one mindset of, oh, I'm only paleo, or I'm only vegan or whatnot, I would be checking the boxes instead of really recognizing and honoring what my own body needs. You know?
Exactly. That's fascinating. I want to touch a little bit more on your story with having the autoimmune disease, and that whole journey where you started looking at the food supply. I'm sure you started researching more the microbiome and leaky gut. Maybe you can touch a little bit more on that story. And what I would really like to get into a little bit further, and I know a lot of my listeners and viewers, they might be familiar with the term leaky gut, but some of them that are listening might be hearing that for the first time. So maybe you can touch a little bit further on what specifically the microbiome is and what leaky gut is. I know that might seem kind of elementary to someone like yourself, but for anyone that's a new term to them, maybe you can touch on that a little bit more and how it relates to autoimmune diseases.
Sure, no problem. And I don't think it's elementary at all. The topic is so complex that we know like a little itty bit. There's so much more that we have to learn, that we get to learn.
Sure.
So all questions are great questions.
Okay.
So the microbiome is really a collection of microorganisms. So, you know, like bacteria, fungi, viruses, and they live all on the outside of your body, like on your skin, covering your eyes, like, and all inside your body, nasal passages, mouth, all the way through your gastrointestinal tract. And what's fascinating is that we always think, like right now, there's this thinking it's been this way for many decades, that it's human versus the pathogens, right? So we have like a war on bacteria, and
Right.
And we try to fight these things. Hence, we have all those hand sanitizers, and like now you can go into a library and there's a hand sanitizing machine right there,
Yep.
And all these disinfectants, and we use bleach in our house to try to kill these things off. We take antibiotics when we get these infections because we have overgrowth of these bacteria. But really what we're learning now is that we are more microbe than we are human. So for instance, we believe we have somewhere between 9 to 10 bacterial cells in our bodies for every one human cell. So we're actually more bacteria than we are human.
That's wild.
Yeah, and what's even cooler is that instead of looking at these microbes as like the enemy that can make us sick, now we're understanding that the microbes in our body, particularly in the gastrointestinal tract, they are like conductors for every organ, every function in our body. So they're actually helping to regulate everything that's happening within your body. So they're critically important for your health and your well-being. And so building what we call a robust microbiome is what Joel and I believe is the critical way to achieve optimal health and wellness.
Yep.
So, whether you're trying to reverse a disease or prevent a disease, or you're trying to win a triathlon, it's really the key is to build a robust microbiome. And when I say a robust microbiome, I mean not only the number of microbes, like in your gastrointestinal tract, for instance, but the type of microbes. So what we're learning is that we are largely, particularly in America, when you consume this Western diet, the standard American diet, and you consume food that's produced in our food supply, you are killing off microbes to a large extent throughout your gastrointestinal tract.
Interesting.
And so there's reports that it could be up to like about 30% of our microbial diversity has been lost already. And this is largely
nutrition?
From nutrition.
Wow.
It's largely from nutrition. And part of that is once you understand the nuances of the food supply, it makes perfect sense because most of the food in the grocery store is actually sterilized. So not just the processed foods, which obviously, a lot of them go through high temperatures and such, and they're not even food anymore. They're like foodstuffs,
Yeah.
So the healthy microbiome, if it had one, is just gone. But meats are sterilized, right? Like for instance, in order for chicken to be sold in a grocery store, it has to be disinfected. And the primary disinfectant is chlorine.
Wow.
So chicken is usually bathed in chlorine before it gets into the grocery store. Same with eggs. Eggs are not only, this is one of the most shocking things that I learned working with Joel, that so eggs have to be also disinfected, usually using chlorine. But get this, the shell of the egg is porous, right? Even the government acknowledges that it's porous.
Wow.
And so some of the chlorine is assumed to get into the egg. And that's why the government actually defines the chlorine treatment as a food additive.
Wow.
Yeah. So those are disinfected, so sterilized. And then even your produce.
Yep.
So produce, if it's not organic, for instance, if it's conventional, then it was probably sprayed with a pesticide or herbicide, most likely glyphosate. Glyphosate itself is an antibiotic. It's patented as an antibiotic. Okay. So that now kills off the good microbes that were on that produce, if there were any, because of the way, in industrial farms, it's usually not a healthy microbiome anyways, but you just killed it off with the glyphosate. And then to get it shipped to the store, they usually cover it in a wax, right? To keep it, to try to prevent it from decaying. And oftentimes the wax will have fungicides in it or other man-made chemicals that are declared to be GRAS, which means they're not tested for safety. So you've just killed off that microbiome that's right there. And even organic ones can have wax. Organic produce can have wax on the outside of it.
Wow.
So, those are just a few examples of
Sure.
how the food is largely sterilized that we're
Right.
eating. And if you eat that sterilized food with, like, for instance, glyphosate residue on it, that is an antibiotic, and then you eat it, you just kill off your microbes. You certainly don't add to your microbes, right? The ideal is to be eating food that's been grown in a regenerative manner, like at Polyface Farm, so that you actually add microbial diversity through the foods that you're eating.
Yep.
Okay, so that's the, I mean, in the long story to explain the microbiome. And so a lot of what we're seeing is when your microbiome, when you decrease the number of microbes, you actually become less resilient from disease. So in other words, you're setting yourself up to develop some kind of autoimmune, chronic or inflammatory disease. We now know that you can lose one type of bacteria in your gastrointestinal tract, and it could lead to cancer. So you can lose another type of bacteria, and it can lead to depression.
Wow.
So it's very important to, every day try to focus on how can I increase my microbial diversity. And we give multiple tips in the book about. For sure. Actually, one of the reviewers, Andy from Manward Press, said that our book is a survival guide for the war on your microbiome.
Wow.
But yeah, so that's important. Also because depending on which microbes you lose or how many you lose, it can create something called gut dysbiosis, an imbalance in your gut. That alone can lead to leaky gut. But leaky gut can also be triggered by a multitude of things. So stress, prescription medications, infections, and that's usually when it happens from an infection, what we call a pathogen. That's usually because you don't have a robust microbiome to be able to defend yourself against that pathogen. All right.
Interesting.
And then leaky gut can also be triggered by other things like chemicals in the food supply, GMOs, the pesticides, all those kinds of things, heavy metals. And so what happens is, to explain leaky gut, in your most of your gastrointestinal tract, there's a single layer of cells, and they're kind of joined together by these, what we call these tight junctions. And when you get leaky gut, it means that there's something wrong with a tight junction. It's not working the way it's supposed to. And so it's like, instead of being like this, it kind of opens up. And when it does that, it allows particles that are bigger to pass through. And those particles aren't actually supposed to pass through and go into your bloodstream. Wow. So it's a breach in your barrier system. So when it goes into your bloodstream, your body's actually trying to help you, because it says, wait a minute, here's a foreign invader. It's not supposed to be here. And so it will mount an immune response. And basically, it's like sending out fighters to go try to squash it and get rid of it. So it's actually trying to help you get rid of it. The problem is, if you healed the leaky gut back, you would be fine. If you kept it open for a multitude of reasons, like you're still just eating pesticides on your food, for instance, and so it's constantly opening it as your body's trying to heal it. If you keep it open over time, that's when it becomes a real problem, because there's the food particles or whatever it is, the microbes that aren't supposed to be in there, when they get into your body, that's when we start seeing like food allergies and food sensitivities really like skyrocketing, because the body thinks it's foreign and it's going to start attacking it and labeling it. So now you've developed a food sensitivity. If it prolongs even longer, that's when you can develop autoimmune conditions. So we think what happens is you have this chronic inflammation, and it could be over like a 10-year time period, right? Most of it's not like, I started eating conventional food, and within 6 months, I got diabetes. These things happen, 8, 10 years, sometimes longer. So if you stay in a state of chronic inflammation over that longer period of time, then your body sometimes can get confused. It's called molecular mimicry. So instead of just attacking that foreign invader that came in, sometimes that foreign invader can look like proteins in your tissues. So like gluten looks a lot like protein in your tissues.
Okay.
And so it will start to attack your own tissues.
Sure.
Because it's confused. Like it's still trying to help you, but it's just confused.
Wow.
And so what you have to do, and that's how you develop the autoimmune disease. So for instance, if it attacks you in your joints, you can develop rheumatoid arthritis. If it attacks you in the pancreas, like if that was your genetically weak link, then you can develop diabetes, and so forth. And this holds true now. We know this connection between leaky gut and every single chronic disease. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if it's cancer, diabetes, heart disease, lupus, arthritis, MS, all of these diseases that we previously categorized as chronic diseases they were recategorized as inflammatory diseases because of this inflammatory process that I'm describing.
Got it.
And now they're slowly starting to be recategorized as autoimmune diseases.
Yep.
It's like all of them.
Yep.
So they all have that similar mechanism.
Yeah. Do you know how many Americans have a chronic disease? Do you have any kind of stat on or general ballpark of how many people in this country have a chronic disease or an autoimmune disease?
So that is actually surprisingly a more difficult question to answer than you think.
Yeah,
you can find
I would imagine
statistics. And so some statistics even say 1 out of 2 Americans has a chronic disease. I believe that. But what I think is even more important to look at is not what the statistic is saying, because those are like diagnosed diseases, right? Well, a lot of people who are on this autoimmune continuum do not have a diagnosis. So I went for like almost 20 years without a diagnosis, where the doctors were just like, we can't figure it out. And then finally at the end, they were like, it has to be in your head. They literally told me the symptoms were in my head. And why? Because they couldn't figure it out. Wow. So a lot of people, I don't know a lot, but many people have not received a diagnosis. They know something's wrong and the doctors can't figure it out. Yeah. And even more importantly is that when you learn that there is this autoimmune continuum, right? Where, I don't know, have you talked about that with your viewers and listeners?
Yeah, a little bit. And the reason why I asked why or how many Americans you think might have a chronic disease or an autoimmune disease is I'm actually one of those people that I believe I do have psoriasis. Based on just what I'm analyzing on my body, it's on my scalp. I have very dry skin, to the point where, I'm looking at pictures and I'm looking at symptoms and I'm like, I'm pretty sure this could be psoriasis, and I haven't seen my doctor about it. And it's been going on for a few months now. But I have not gone in because I'm kind of avoiding hospitals right now. Yeah. And soon I will go back in and get it checked out. But to your point, myself being one of those people that could have an autoimmune disease, and is not even diagnosed yet. It just goes to show how many people in this country really have something that is just not right.
Yeah, and we're not really trained to recognize when we are on the autoimmune continuum. So it's my perspective, the more people that I meet, and the more people that I talk to, the more emails I receive and whatnot, the more I'm realizing that the majority of people in this country are already on this autoimmune continuum.
Yep.
And it starts. So if we want to break down the continuum, on the one side there would be no signs of inflammation, right? And there's like hardly anybody there. Yep. And then as you move along the continuum, as your chronic level of inflammation is sustained, like what we talked about with leaky gut, as you sustain it because you haven't healed the gut, you will develop more and more symptoms of inflammation. So your first symptom might be seasonal allergies. And we don't think anything of that because that's so common nowadays. And you just get, the prescription for it or the over the counter, and it's like, oh yeah, take care of that, Right. But that's an early indicator of an inflammatory condition. So you have that, you can have itchy skin. Mine started at a very young age with bumps on the back of my arm, that wouldn't go away even when I had my omegas balanced.
Yep.
So it could be that. It could be chronic headaches, high blood pressure. High blood pressure is a sign of inflammation right there. So you move along this continuum. It could be dysregulation of your glucose values. So maybe you have a high fasting glucose, but you're not like diabetic yet. Maybe you have brain fog. Maybe you have difficulty learning. And so you move along, and as you're moving up this continuum, your symptoms are getting worse and worse until the point where a medical doctor presumably would diagnose you with the disease. So maybe it's diabetes, maybe it's heart disease, maybe it's lupus, and all the way at the end of this continuum, end stage autoimmune would be cancers. So they're all along this continuum. Wow. And so the earlier you start to reverse the inflammation, the easier it is. Like, I'm a firm believer that at all stages of this continuum, practically all stages of the continuum, you can completely reverse any illness. And I've seen it within myself. I've seen it within my own family, within people I've worked with. Yeah. And in the literature, it's even now in scientific literature, kidney disease has been reversed. Cancer has had spontaneous remissions, So I believe these things are all possible, but you have to be aware so that you can even identify, oh, my psoriasis is on this continuum. Continuum means I'm inflamed, or seasonal allergies. This really does mean that I am inflamed. What can I do about it? Exactly. So to your point, when you're trying to come up with numbers and how many people have autoimmune in this country, I think it's an overwhelming number. Yep. That, because where are you going to define it? Yeah. Is it once you get the diagnosis? Well, I don't like to look at it that way. I like to look at it as soon as we have the earliest symptom, let's do something about it right then. Exactly.
Have you heard of Dr. Stephen Gundry?
Yes.
Yeah, so I came across him, I don't know, maybe 4 months ago, and ironically, it was like right around the same time that I started noticing that I have dry skin and it could potentially be psoriasis. And I heard him on a few different interviews talking about leaky gut, and that's where I was kind of really introduced to that whole idea of the microbiome, leaky gut, the connection there, and how it could lead to chronic diseases and autoimmune disease. So I've been following him quite a bit lately. I'm actually super excited. He agreed to come on my podcast in about a month, so I'm super excited for that conversation.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited for that. But he, a lot of what you're talking about right now is kind of his mission, and just looking at the foods that we're putting into our body to make sure we're boosting our microbiome. So I guess on that note, I know you have so many tips in your book about, having a more robust microbiome. What can we be doing to kind of get there? And I know that's a very loaded question, but what are some starter practical steps for that?
Sure. Yeah. Fantastic question. So there's lots of easy things you can do initially. So one would be to upgrade from conventional to organic, right? To decrease that toxic burden on your gastrointestinal tract and the microbes in particular. The other would be to consume like probiotics, and I'm really big into consuming them through your food and not through a supplement. Because the supplement is pretty much a handful of microbes at a very high dose. And so you can actually develop small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, from consuming high dose probiotics. So even though they're good microbes, you can still get an overgrowth of them because everything needs to be in balance. It also when you consume probiotics from a supplement, and now let me put in a caveat. I think there's a therapeutic use for probiotics. So when I was rebalancing my gastrointestinal tract and my son's, who was 6 at the time, we did take high dose probiotics. But that was because we had such severe dysbiosis in our gut. So I do think there's a therapeutic purpose, but if you're having to take it long term,
right,
then that's not good, because you're also, not only can you develop SIBO from it, but you're also creating a less diversity in your gut. So I don't support that. So instead, get it from foods. And you can even buy these at the grocery store if you don't want to make your own. Like I get a raw sauerkraut from the grocery store. You know, you can just eat something like that, like kombucha, like any of those kinds of things. And then along with that, the microbes need food. Like the microbes need something to eat, and that would be a prebiotic. So I tell people, just try to add in one new prebiotic each week. So like celery, for instance, is a prebiotic.
Okay.
I mean, and that tastes pretty good. You know, you can put some like nut butter or, you know, something on it that you'll want to eat. I chop it up and put it in my salads, you know, so use like that. Garlic, I put raw garlic in my guacamole. So easy things like that. So add in some prebiotics. A big one is practicing forgiveness. So your emotions, we know, can change your gut microbiome, like the composition of them and the numbers of them. And so when you hold on to negative emotions, it damages your gut microbiome. So for me, a good one is, I tell people, one of the best, like I'm not into detoxification protocols. You know, I'm into more of a daily upkeep of your body. And not shocking it with these protocols unless it's absolutely essential. But the one detox that I do is an emotional detox. So, and I like to try to do that every day, you know, practicing forgiveness every day. So that helps, you know, meditation can help because it's basically getting you out of fight or flight. And when you're in fight or flight, that primes you to develop chronic disease. And we know that it causes an imbalance in your gastrointestinal, you know, flora. So those are all easy things that they can just start with. You know, some of them are free. I mean, practicing forgiveness is free. Like
exactly. On that note, you may know Ben Greenfield. He's big into nutrition and fitness, and I was listening to an interview he was having a while back. He talked about how every night when he sits down with his family for a meal, they all, his wife, his kids, and himself, they sit down, and the first thing that they do is they take 3 deep breaths. And that's just helping them kind of relieve that stress, because you don't want to be eating when you're stressed. So they do that, 3 deep breaths, and then they say grace, and then they get into their meal. And I thought that was so cool to think about that, how stress can affect our health when it comes to eating.
Yes, and you bring up an excellent point, and that's something that we address in Beyond Labels as well. Is that it's not what you eat and how you eat are equally important. So you can take all these lab tests and figure out exactly what your body wants, and then make that food, you know, from regenerative sources. But if you sit down and eat it, and you're in fight or flight, you're stressed out, it can still cause inflammation in your body. And so what we now know is that 60%, possibly up to 80% of your digestion doesn't actually happen in your gastrointestinal tract. It actually happens in your mind.
Wow.
So you have to be mentally prepared to receive a meal. And this is something that, you know, I mean, I used to be the worst at this, like eating in the car, driving the kids from here to there, or, you know, when I worked in a corporate office, I would eat at my desk, working on the computer, you know, shoving the food in. So it's something that I did have to retrain myself of how to eat, what we say is mindfully. And so in my house, we all sit down for every meal that we're eating together. We get the meal and we sit down. And actually, when you're cooking your own food, that also is helping you prime yourself mentally, like smelling the food and whatnot. It's part of the whole preparation for your digestive system. So we sit down, and before we eat, we do something similar where we go around the table and we all say 3 things we're grateful for. And because practicing gratitude, like I said, shifts you out of fight or flight into the rest and digest. But what we do that's a little different is that we say things that we're thankful for, and then we say a proactive prayer. So we will say, thank you for allowing our bodies to fully digest and absorb all the nutrients it needed from this meal.
Nice.
You say it as though it already happened.
Yep.
And then that primes your body that, oh, okay. And then it actually is more efficient at digesting and absorbing.
I'm so happy you mentioned gratitude. I just had a guy on my podcast named Ian Hart, and he talked about gratitude, specifically exactly what you're just talking about, specifically before eating, because we've really lost, I shouldn't speak generally for everybody, but most people have lost the idea of gratitude when it comes to our food. And what he was talking about was, our ancestors, let's say hundreds, even thousands of years ago, the hunter and gatherers, right? They had to, it was a big chore, it was a big job to go out and get food, right? You'd have to hunt it, gather it, bring it back, cook it, prepare it and cook it. That could be at the very least a full day. Sometimes it would be a couple of days project. So then when you actually sat down and ate that food, you had such an overwhelming sense of gratitude. And we've really lost that, unfortunately, in today's world where everything is so convenient. You can, even if you're not ordering in or going through a drive-through, like just going to a grocery store is not that difficult. Like you can just go and get food and have it prepared in an hour. So I'm really happy you brought up that idea of gratitude, because I think we could probably all use a little bit more of that in our lives.
Yeah, and I think it probably too, like you're describing, it was probably a slow evolution of losing this gratitude as we slowly, particularly since the early 1900s, as we have become more and more disconnected from our food supply, from the actual source of the food. So I think when you are so disconnected, it really is pretty easy to lose that gratitude.
Yep.
Like, for instance, like my children are 6 and 10. And, if it wasn't for us taking them to the farm and showing them, like, this is actually where the food comes from. I mean, if you think about it just in isolation, none of your experiences, just think about what that 6-year-old and 10-year-old, what they have experienced, in a normal household. The food comes from the grocery store.
Right.
Like, that's just where you get it,
Right.
Like, I remember when my nephew was 6 and he would drink chocolate milk all the time. And I asked him, do you know where chocolate milk comes from? And he literally said, from the chocolate cows. And I'm like, I mean, and it's adorable, but it's like, he actually thinks that, he didn't know where a prune actually came from. What is a prune, and that has not changed as he's gotten older. And not to put down the generation, but to show an example of how far removed we are from our food. And so they're gonna, if they don't know that's where the food came from, and this is what the farmer had to do to raise this cow, to milk this cow, to get it there, we can't expect them to be grateful.
Yep.
Right, because they just don't know. It's not their reference point. So that's one reason why I think it's really important, just particularly for the younger generations, is to not only show them where the food comes from, go to one of these farms. And if you're not around a farm or you can't get one, now we have the internet where they're all over. You can show them pictures and videos of farms and show them where the food actually comes from. So you don't even have to leave your house to be able to do that. Make it part of their curriculum. But also then to get them in the kitchen with you and to cook with you. Like, my kids have been cooking with me since they were 2.
Yep.
And so they understand, it actually helped them to not waste so much food.
Sure.
Because they had to make it. Like, they, and they're like, I spent time making that.
Yeah, they know what went into it. Exactly.
Yeah. And so they have a different level of appreciation for the food, like if my kids weren't in the kitchen with me at all and we sat down to eat a meal, and I asked them to be mindful. So I asked them, okay, take a moment and smell the food first. What do you smell? Right? They're not going to probably be able to identify the different spices and stuff and to really appreciate what went into that meal if I didn't have them in the kitchen cooking with me. So it does, all these little things that you can do with your children, it does help connect them to the food supply, and it helps to grow that level of gratitude, which is going to help them better digest and absorb that meal.
I think that's brilliant. I love that. I want to touch a little bit more on the idea of food supply. I know you said a good thing is to go from conventional to organic, at least start there. How can we take that a step further? I mean, an obvious thing would be, visiting something like Polyface Farms. Where can, I guess my main question is, where can people find the right foods?
Yeah, so it depends on what type of food you're talking about. But if we're talking about meat, for instance, you can, so Polyface Farm now delivers nationwide. So
cool. That's
it
awesome.
it used to only be local, right?
Yep.
But now as we have Amazon delivering food to doorsteps and all these other companies,
Sure.
they had to evolve too,
Yep.
or they were going to get crushed in the system.
Right.
So anybody in the United States can actually order their food from Polyface Farm directly. Just go to their website and order it. Yeah. So and there's other regenerative farms as well that you can find online that are also shipping.
Got it.
So that's one option. In the grocery store, there's a label that's still in its infancy. There's a few products that have been labeled already, but they are planning to roll out a bunch more. And this is a label that's put out by the Savory Institute.
Okay.
And it's like ecologically verified outcome. Or ecologically outcome verified. It's EOV.
Okay. Cool.
And so if you look for that seal, that means that food went through their verification process to be called regenerative.
Got it.
Yeah, so there is a label in the grocery store. And like I said, right now I think that label it's on a beef jerky.
Okay.
I'm not sure. It might be Epic, but I'm not quite sure. Don't quote me on that.
Okay.
But I can send you a link if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great. I can include
ahead.
that in the description and show notes.
Yeah, so it is on a few products. And
Cool.
as people buy more and more of those products,
Yep.
then the market is speaking, right? So the demand is up. And so they're going to be able to produce more, products that are verified by them. So that would be the quickest way, probably in the grocery store, to identify something that was grown or raised regeneratively. If not, then the other option is, buying from an online farmer directly.
Yep, that's great. I didn't realize Polyface Farms delivers nationwide. That's really cool.
Yeah, that was more of a recent thing that, Joel and them didn't want to do that. They really wanted to stay local.
Sure.
But like I said, when the market shifts, right, the people demanded something different. The people wanted the convenience of food delivered at the doorsteps, for instance. And I do that too. I'm part of that people group.
Right.
I get I buy produce from Misfits Market that gets delivered to my home. But it supports my principles, right? It is organic produce, and they have rescued the misfits, right? The ones that the farmers couldn't sell or the grocery stores wouldn't accept.
Yeah.
And so we're reducing waste when we buy from companies like Misfits Market. So,
that's great.
But all that to say that the market has shifted and consumer demand has shifted. So Polyface had to change in order to, stay competitive.
That's great. I'm happy to hear that. Before I get into my last question here, I want to give you a chance to share with my audience where they can find you. Your book, Beyond Labels, can be found on Amazon. Is there any other spots you'd like to kind of direct people to? Sure. Yeah. Beyond Labels can be found, like you said, on Amazon. And at this point, it's anywhere books are sold. So Target, Walmart, Barnes & Noble. You can also buy it directly from Polyface Farm on their website, polyfacefarms.com. And you can find me on my website, which is handsoffmyfood.com. Very good. And I'll be sure to have that all linked up in the show notes and the description. Excellent. So my last question for you is, who do you want to impact the most with your work? Wow, no one's ever asked me that. Well, I think the most important group to impact at this point is children. My hope is that my generation lifts that veil of unearned trust in the food supply. So
we're the ones that are starting to say, wait a minute, something's wrong. We want something different, so kind of like stop it, stop this mass snowball effect that's happening. And then I think it's going to be our children's generation, most likely, that's going to be able to really start reversing it. So I think it's important to reach out to the children. For the current book, for Beyond Labels, it would be appropriate for teenagers to read the book. My 10-year-old can read it, so it's definitely at a level that a child can read it. But realistically, I hope that it reaches people who are struggling, who know that they're sick, who are looking for their second chance, and they've been turned down, or disappointed by the medical system. They don't know where to go, don't know who to turn to, but they want to make a change. They're ready to make a change, and they're trying to find that second chance. And so I'm hoping that the book helps those people, because I know how that feels to not have hope, and to feel like you're alone. And I don't want people to feel that way. I want them to know that I believe them. Joel believes them. We know there's a problem. There are solutions, and we're there to help them with an open, loving, and compassionate heart to help them find that second chance that they're so desperately seeking.
I love it. I'm really happy you mentioned young people, because like you said, I think it's so important that we learn about this as soon as we can, so that we can start making changes as soon as possible. So I just think that's super important.
Yeah, and what, I was surprised, and we may turn it into this, but some of my friends are actually using the book as a curriculum for children. Yeah, this is their food and health curriculum.
I love that. Yeah. I think if we can learn more about this, especially in the school system, it's something that I think definitely needs to be taught to younger generations. So I appreciate you doing that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Anytime. I would love to get into the school systems. I mean, unfortunately, now they still teach the dietary guidelines. So.
Yeah, and that's a whole other topic, another conversation for another day, because that's a loaded one. Just what they're teaching, it's scary. But the work you're doing and Joel is doing, I think, is a step in the right direction for sure.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, and hope you have a great day.
You too. Thank you for having me.
Of course, my pleasure.